Matt Bohr started drawing editorial cartoons for a student newspaper while attending the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. His work has since appeared in the Los Angeles Times, The Nation, The Village Voice, and The Daily Beast, among others. His first graphic novel, War is Boring, was a collaboration with journalist David Axe. It came out in 2010 from New American Library. More recently, his hysterical and pointed collection of comics entitled We Should Improve Society Somewhat came out in June of last year from Clover Press. We talk about both books at length here, and also discuss Matt's current and upcoming projects, his decision to leave editorial cartooning, and why he's pursuing different artistic goals in the wake of the nightmare of Trump's authoritarian populism. Incredibly, he's embarking on these new projects while doing all of the labor required to keep The Nib going. The Nib is an online daily comics publication and a crucial space for comic strip interventions on contemporary issues. It daily features political cartoons, graphic journalism, essays, and memoir. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation. Matt expands on what it meant to enter publishing at what he calls the tail end of print, only to find that while social media seemed to be this new frontier for publication, it was basically impossible to make a living by being online. Now, though, of course, using a hybrid method, the Nib is showing how comics can thrive and find new audiences. Matt, perhaps more than most cartoonists, has had to deal with the volatile nature of contemporary political discourse and polarization. He's also witnessed firsthand the sort of state violence that organized protest can provoke. He describes in this interview the horrifying experience of being in Portland in 2020 and witnessing the realization of Trump's fascist rhetoric in the form of police and federal agents warring with protesters, as he puts it. But the interview ends on a somewhat more positive note, perhaps somewhat unusual for this podcast. Matt feels that as a public, we've reached a level of political education where far more now understand the problems we face and routinely engage with the reality of a, quote, hell world. The challenge now would seem to be redirecting the frustration and resignation that people feel at not being able to act quickly or collectively into meaningful mass movements. Matt, welcome. It's so great that you were able to make the time. Big fan of your work, both in terms of your cartooning, your graphic output, but also the work behind the scenes. My first question is about a shift in what you're doing creatively at the moment. So in April of this, you posted a piece on Medium announcing that after 18 years, more than 1,600 political cartoons, you'd no longer be producing your own weekly comic. And so I wanted to ask about this decision. Like, why did you leave editorial cartooning in favor of nonfiction work or comics journalism?
Well, I've been drawing political cartoons since I was 19 years old, and I'm 38 now. So nearly 20 years, my entire adult life, my entire career. And over time, I started out being very interested in all kinds of comics since I was a little kid. Superhero stuff, and then as I got older, more indie stuff, and then nonfiction stuff. And I only came to political cartoons because I got very political in the aftermath of 9/11 and the run-up to the Iraq War, and had things to say about it, and found political cartoons a good vehicle for doing so. And I got really into the form and everything, but I wouldn't say I started out with strips, comic strips, or editorial cartoons being the primary reason I was drawn to comics. And so as time has gone on, the desire to do other kinds of comics has never really gone away, doing graphic novels or even more mainstream type of comic books. And after the Trump administration and the pandemic, I was really burnt out on politics. Everything is just so bad all the time. I felt like I was essentially saying the same things over and over. And, I wasn't sure that I wanted my entire career from the age of 19 to whenever I die to just be doing political cartoons. So I just decided to finally go for it. I also run the Nib, which is most of my work week. It's really time consuming. I have two kids, two young kids. The youngest was born in January of 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. My life is just really busy and exhausting, and I came to the conclusion that if I ever wanted to do anything else artistically, that something had to give. And so those are the reasons why I quit the strip.
I interviewed Durf Backdurf for the podcast, and he talks about his own transition from a weekly strip into these long form pieces that now have gained him a certain level of like authority within the comics world. Even adapting his book My Friend Dahmer into a film. So I'm excited about what you're going to produce. And
Yeah.
Jason, yeah, sorry, you go ahead.
Oh no, thanks. And yeah, I had actually talked to Durf about this ahead of time. I kind of called a lot of cartoonists I know, especially ones like Durf who had actually done this, and
Mm-hmm.
just tried to trying to walk myself up to the line so that I could cross it because it's such a big deal to do when you've done nothing else. I mean, I've met my weekly deadline, you know, through all-nighters and even though I'm a cartoonist and I have a career and appear successful and stuff. It's still something that's kind of done on the back end of, daily work and staying up late to get it done. And I once you're used to doing that, it's almost hard to stop. And then now that I stopped, I couldn't even imagine having to do a comic next week. I mean, that schedule is just really grueling psychologically. And doing a big graphic novel the way Durf is and everything, I mean, that's hard too. I did one of those, but it's a totally different way of approaching work, I guess, and I'm kind of excited to do it eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I do plan to write and draw my own work in the way that Durf and others do, but really I'm writing a lot of comics right now. Maybe not a lot. I'm writing some comics right now,
Mm-hmm.
and my hope is to kind of get into that a little bit because I don't really feel like I have to draw everything that I'm interested in or that I want to create, and it actually would be quite time consuming and hard for me to do so.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so interesting, like this idea of being addicted to a routine, even if it's like grueling because it's familiar. And like you're in this place where as you say, like you're crossing a line and changing that. And it's being kind of reported on because the nib has a certain kind of like status in the indie comics world. Jason Vondersmith wrote this article for the Portland Tribune last year, talking about how the nib was effectively dropped in 2019 by its parent company, First Look
Yeah.
Media. But the nib lives on primarily because of your work to preserve it and perpetuate it. And I wonder if you could speak to your original vision for the nib, and how you figured out the like technical and logistical details of running the site, the print magazine, all of its social media tentacles. Like, how did you get to that point where you had those skills?
Well, I guess I, started out from the position of being a lifelong freelancer who has come up in a media ecosystem in which you're responsible for figuring out how to manage everything in your career from, marketing to printing to shipping, um, asking for money online, doing Kickstarters. That's the world that I came into, kind of the tail end of print. The rise of social media um, is really what made my career, or what allowed me to bridge it to the next phase, I guess. Because there really wasn't money in being online at first. It's kind of hilarious now, but there was a lot of arguments between like old print cartoonists and then young web cartoonists about what the future of the medium was and whether you should give your work on away online for free and then try to make merchandise or put a tip jar or whatever. And now you actually can make money online. And the nib is kind of a using some of those models, using like the webcomic model. That kind of sounds silly. I mean, really, it's just using a traditional publication model, but uniting a bunch of different uh, people, creators, in this case cartoonists, under one umbrella and calling it a publication. I thought I could do that because there wasn't actually a home for most political cartoons, particularly the kind that I was drawn to, which used to be called alt weekly cartooning, but it's not really apt anymore since alt weeklies have also kind of collapsed. But more modern political cartoon styles that aren't like the traditional old school cartooning. Those people never really had a home. They didn't have staff jobs. A lot of them were, really well. They promoted themselves on social media and they had followings and they took to the online world really well. Whereas a lot of the people who had comfortable staff jobs just didn't have a need to do that. And so, I thought that by bringing in all the types of cartooning that I liked, political cartooning, nonfiction cartooning. I guess those aren't all the types of cartooning that I like, but they're the ones that spoke to, what I wanted to do with my work and with other people's work, which is talk about the world, politics, issues that matter through comics. And so political cartooning, it was kind of like saving it or creating a space for it to survive and live and to find all these people doing it under one house. And then with nonfiction cartooning, it was more of like promoting a new kind of cartooning that really hadn't when we started like 8 years ago, was far less prominent than it was now. Of course there was Joe Sacco and everything, but like, Nate Powell and Durf and hadn't come out with books, and Sarah Glidden might have come out with her first book by then, I forget. But it was really in the early stages of so I really wanted to kind of push that, and like I had a long-standing interest in doing nonfiction cartooning myself, but then I ended up not actually doing all that much of it because I was running the nib the whole time.
Yeah, this is the thing. And so like you're commissioned to basically preserve some like space at what you call the tail end of print, where print is like it's not dead, but it seems like it's constantly ending. And that becomes like in a sense your, main political like imperative is to create this home for political cartooning. And in that home, in that creation of like a space for incubating this style of communication, you talk about like in that Vandersmith piece, you talk about how the indie comic world is left leaning, and that you're explicitly running a publication with a point of view on things like equality, social justice, and climate change. But one of the things that I really picked up on is this idea that you are not interested in hearing from the other side. To me, that's refreshing. That you basically admit that you have a commitment to providing a kind of comics archive that conveys a certain like clarity on issues without feeling compelled to compromise by appealing to notions of like balance. I struggle as a podcaster and like teacher because I don't want to shut down the conversation with students or listeners who kind of can't go to a progressive place or accept that maybe capitalism has some pretty destructive effects. Do you think it's like liberating on some level to just have a platform of your own where you can do that sort of politically independent curation of content? Like, why is that important?
Yeah, it's not, I guess I don't really want to create a publication for everyone, and I don't mind just having a focus of it being left leaning. I mean, I wish that there was a bunch of different comics publications, so if somebody wants to make a conservative one, they should. We did run one conservative cartoonist for a little while in the early days, and I think most of the readers probably hated him. And I think especially online, it's actually kind of almost impossible to do this stuff because, I mean, even running things that span the liberal to left spectrum. I mean, you have people on the left who really hate things that are more centrist and liberal, and people on the center who really despise the left in a lot of ways. So I mean, we found I've had a lot of problems with that stuff, mainly around election coverage type stuff, like whenever I would be in an election period, I always hate those. I always hate them because, doing work where you're attacking the candidates always alienates people. So, if you're going after Joe Biden from the left, um, people don't want you to do that because then they'll say, you're helping Trump. And so it's even kind of volatile to just have a left-wing publication, right? I'm not interested in really having conservative voices arguing for their positions anyway, because I fundamentally disagree with them so strongly. But I don't, even if I wanted to, I don't think I would be capable of having a sustainable publication in that way. Like, I think it would just, alienate readers and they would say, I don't want to support this.
Yeah, and it's super tricky. I mean, it's like it's a difficult question. Balance is something that is seen as like this is the thing, like kind of incontestable notions of neutrality and so on. But I think now more than ever, in some ways, that position of neutrality is itself a position and kind of like
Yeah.
a problematic one, right? Like to stay in that state of like ambiguity regarding these like life or death questions is irresponsible in certain ways, I think.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's not too hard to really it doesn't end up being too hard to construct a publication around this because, like you mentioned, almost the entirety of the indie comics world is very left leaning now. I mean, I don't know if I can even think of any or many conservatives. They're probably not uh, sticking their neck out too far. Like
No. Yeah.
the maybe if there was a bigger, if there were more cartoonists, there was a much larger ecosystem and many more publications supporting it, we would see a lot more ideological diversity. And then you could have, the nib or whatever, then you could have a version of it that's more like the Atlantic, and then you could have, your right wing site. But there just isn't enough cartoonists, political cartoonists, to ever warrant anything like that. Um, so it doesn't happen, as it is. It's like the when I first came up in cartooning in like the small, indie comics, small press scene, or when I say small press, I mean like small press expo, like what is being put out by Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly, Top Shelf, that type of thing. The big guys, who were all guys when I was coming up, it was like Craig Thompson and Chris Ware and Daniel Klaus. And now it is a lot of, younger people, tons of queer and trans cartoonists. Everybody's, very political and left wing. So it's not really, that's the pool that I'm, you know, drawing from now, and it's not too hard to come up with a lot of left wing voices.
Sure. And it sounds like what you're colliding with is like an internal division within the left, which is really interesting too. And I've seen that move to kind of radicalize to some extent or diversify publishing at even the highest levels, as it were. Like these are prestigious publications, right? And they are moving toward more diverse voices. I think the Now series from Fantagraphics is evidence of that. But
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of switch gears and talk about War is Boring, your book.
Mhm.
The full title is War is Boring, Bored Stiff, Scared to Death in the World's Worst War Zones. And it's a book that I found incredibly interesting. Like it's a story. It is not a polemic, right? You co-authored this with
Yeah.
David Axe. The big difference with this book is that you're not authoring it, you're illustrating it. And so I wonder, like in thinking back to that book, how close you feel to the book's messages, ideas, and stories, and if you generally feel like you develop a personal investment in the things that you're illustrating.
Uh, yeah, it's a good question. It's I illustrated that so long ago now. I mean, I forget what year it came out. 2011, maybe 2012 or before. I honestly don't even know. When you do
20,
something like that,
2010. 2010.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So now it's been 11 years. I mean, I haven't read it, um, certainly not since it came out. I don't know if I read it in its final form or not. I think the last time I probably read it was a PDF, sending it to press, making sure all the copy was right. Like you spend so much time on something like that, looking at the script, spending hours on the pages, I have no ability to sort of read it objectively or know what it's like to read it, or I don't really have an interest in going back and rereading my old work necessarily. So, I know that I got into it because I'd met David at a comic convention, and he had done a previous memoir called War Fix that was similar in tone, and it was about his becoming a war correspondent when the Iraq War started. And I had a lot of interest in the post 9/11 landscape of wars that we were waging. Really, a lot of my earlier work is all about it. And even though, like you said, his is not really a polemic, and it is not really focused on the people in these places necessarily. It's about his experience as a war correspondent. I still, that was the type of work that I was gravitating toward and wanted to do, and he wanted to collaborate with me, and I didn't have any ideas for a nonfiction graphic novel at the time, so it was a good opportunity for me. I was like, I don't know, mid late 20s when we probably signed a book deal with that. As for the message of the book, I guess it depends. I think that what message you draw from the book depends, is what I mean. There's the text, and then there's the subtext to it. Like, David doesn't have an explicitly anti-war position that he advocates for in the book, which would be my position. But I think I don't know how people can read this stuff about the world and not come to those conclusions, though I know that a lot of people do. I think that David wrote that book. He has an almost cynical worldview in the book. I mean, I think that he wrote it, and the book is basically half about this, about his exhaustion with his kind of addiction to being a war correspondent and seeing all this trauma and how it affects him, and asking himself what is it that he's addicted to, and does this change anything? And I don't think that the book has any clear answers about that, but I think he wrote it directly from that place that he was afterwards. And now it's 10 years later. I mean, I haven't been in touch with him for a while, but I know that he's not hopping around war zones anymore. He's like directing cheap horror films. So maybe he's in a better place, and he would have a whole different take on it. I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth kind of thinking about, and obviously, like I say, it's you're not responsible for as it were, the messages in that book, but it allowed you to kind of in some ways develop artistically. And I can see you in those pages, as Noah Van Sciver puts it, flexing artistically. Like, there are specific moments. And yeah, I mean, like, you're also responsible for trying to illustrate the sort of trajectory of David's thinking in that book. Like, the beginning is this kind of open romanticizing of war. There's a lot of that, this sense that, like, war is something just thrilling, in which you get this unparalleled experience of being alive when you're close to death. But then the end of that book arrives at a very different conclusion about war, that it may be something fundamental to human nature, or something totally external, an aberration, as he puts it. But it starts by asking these questions. And, there's like one line in the book that really stood out that I wanted to ask you about, where somebody who's actually on the ground experiencing the situation says, occupation breeds desperation, desperation breeds violence, violence breeds corruption, corruption breeds instability, and instability means we have to intervene. Because this is where we're at, a decade later, is,
Yeah.
an intervention of 20 years in Afghanistan has completely failed. And you have people like Bernie Sanders, who are icons of the progressive left, occupying sort of a similarly ambivalent position about what the U.S. was doing there. Like, he said recently, no one he knows is a fan of the authoritarianism of the Taliban, but there are equally no people in his ranks that support intervention. And so it's like, what do you do with that impasse? Is there a way theoretically for something like comics journalism to navigate it and expose the hypocrisies latent in it?
I'd love to think so and say yes. It'd be a great world if that were true. And I mean, I think it is to an extent, right? Like anything that you create that sheds light on the on the world and its problems can help, sort of push things along. I mean, that's how I've always viewed my work and wanting to talk about, important issues, is like trying to affect the discussion in really small ways. Obviously, one comic or one graphic novel isn't going to change the world. I don't know that comics has any special ability to do that. I mean, I love comics as a medium. That's how I think, and that's how I want to tell stories. But I can't say that a graphic novel is more affecting than a good documentary or a good piece of journalism, right? Like that's just the medium that I'm drawn to. So I don't know that comics has any special ability to do it, but you know, maybe.
And I love that you kind of take that position, because in the academy and the university, I do find that like comic studies as like a subfield of a field, it has this weird obsession with like almost
Mhm.
novelty, right? With the uniqueness or singularity of comics as a form of communication. But yeah, you like other comics, cartoonists I've spoken with, express this like, sort of debt almost to documentary, or at least, I mean, this is how Box Brown talks about his own comics, that
Mm.
he's like drawing a lot from documentary. And, like you're trying to affect the discussion. One of the ways that you're trying to affect the discussion in War is Boring is through, I think, the representation of violence. Durf is doing it in the same way in Kent State.
Hmm.
And it's something I've thought a lot about in relationship to comics as a form of communication. Like it's different from documentary, where you actually are confronted with, like, there's a new documentary on the Attica prison uprising, for example. There you're confronted with the real violent consequences of a form of state violence, right? And the difference is that those are real bodies, actual victims being shown, and there's a risk of re-traumatizing those who have already suffered, and I think a risk of desensitizing audiences to trauma if that real footage of violence isn't framed appropriately. When you put together your images of, like, I think about this one panel in particular, where you depict an attack on an armored vehicle in Afghanistan, you're making choices about how to depict a really sensitive subject. Like you depict a dismembered child in that scene. And I wonder what sorts of
Yeah.
ethical or political dilemmas you faced in making those kinds of choices.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that was in the script, so it's definitely, what David intended to show, and I think that it is about showing, the horrors of this conflict and what it actually does to people. And I know that, you can convey the same thing with off-screen violence or, showing it in different ways. Uh, Trying to remember how we were thinking about it then, though, like 11 years ago or more, really. I probably drew it 13 years ago because it takes so long to draw these damn things. That's one thing that really cuts against comics as a medium for journalism. I mean, it takes kind of too
Right.
long to do something about it. So you have to really, Durf doing Kent State works out well, but you
Yeah,
can't
it's
exactly
terrible
do
strain on the
anything.
wrist to try to keep up with
Yeah,
this
you
news cycle.
yeah, you can't do anything that's too pressing. But yeah, I mean, if I was drawing that book today, I mean, I might be a little more worried about that. I'm not sure, honestly, because I do feel like we have to show these things sometimes, and people are not confronted enough with the results of these wars that, they support casually, in the aftermath of 9/11, and then it's a conflict that lasts for 20 years that they basically have no connection to or even knowledge of. I mean, I don't think most Americans know the the first thing about Afghanistan, what languages they speak, can't name many cities, really just don't know much about it at all unless you know someone who's served there, maybe. Um, so, but like you were talking about with the Attica documentary, which I don't know about, but I really would be interested in. Framing it appropriately is also right. I don't just think that throwing things in people's faces necessarily doesn't convince them. Otherwise, it would be a lot easier to turn people against war.
And yeah, I mean, that question of framing comes up in one panel from your book, your more recent book, We Should Improve Society Somewhat. Brilliant title, by the way. We Should Improve Society Somewhat. Like this like ironic appeal for just like meager reform is so funny. In the panel, you use your classic cartoon rendering of Donald Trump, but you also use you use Trump and also a speech in which Trump basically claims that protesters don't face any level of violence today, and so on. But you superimpose that on top of actual images of iconic images of state violence. One of them actually being the photo
Yeah.
of a protester laying on the ground after the massacre at Kent State. Why in that panel did it make more sense to just include the photos, right? Images have changed struggles over time. Having that actual archival like image is politically transformative. Do you remember what your thought process was when making that specific point about Trump's hypocrisy?
Yeah, I do. It was I'm 99% sure that comic ran before he was elected because he was campaigning and talking about people disrupting his rallies. And in the old days, they'd haul them out on a stretcher, and he was saying, he'd pay the legal fees of someone if they punched a protester and these kind of things. And I think even for those of us who were paying close attention, the last 4 or 5 years have really become this blur of, outrage and constant offense over all of these horrors that have been going on, and just, Trump's constant tweeting and insanity. But back then, there were far less people who really admitted that this guy was who he was telling us who he was, right? I mean, even his supporters, there's always a level of plausible deniability with what he's really advocating for, what he's saying. Even if he's saying explicit things like punch a protester in the face, when he's saying there are not consequences for protesting anymore, or in the old days, we used to do this. I mean, what's he talking about? He's talking explicitly about those things. Even if he would deny, or his supporters would deny that that's what he really meant, what could he possibly be saying but those things? So, that's, and when you look at his age and when he came up, I mean, that's exactly what he's referring to. He's referring to the good old days of, his his youth, when police violence was not as openly challenged and controversial. So I wanted to show that stuff, just explicitly, just to say this is what he's talking about, and with no subtext. This is just it. And like the Kent State shooting is one of the pictures, like you mentioned. I mean, I remember thinking at the time that this stuff was going to happen under Trump if he was elected, and in some ways it did. I mean, I was living in Portland, Oregon in the summer of 2020, and there were, police, well, not even police, but, federal agents warring with police protesters every night. And it felt like we were one day away from them shooting and killing someone on the streets. They were going around in unmarked vans, snatching people up, like the type of stuff that was shocking, really, but also was kind of predictable because Trump was telegraphing it years in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to me like the whole point of comics in some sense, or at least the way that you approach it, is to try and communicate all of that in like an immediate visual way. Like all of the visual elements have to combine to convey this like explicit point that that can get lost within like everyday political discourse.
Yeah.
But I guess on the question of violence still. I wanted to ask how you dealt with having this particular panel removed from Instagram for supposedly promoting violence, because this is a
Yeah.
panel entirely about the kind of like vectors of violence in the United States, especially in how it's rooted in a lot of white supremacist ideology. Was there something vindicating also maybe about being able to include it in the book, We Should Improve Society Somewhat, and like even address the fact that it had been removed through the social media practice of like scrubbing the web for any, objectionable images?
Yeah, it's I know it's a thing that plagues artists who do any work shows violence or is political or depicts sex. Um, those three things are just flagged a lot by social media companies, and honestly, really, it's when people report it. Um, Whether it's an algorithm or at some point in the line they do have a bunch of humans that review hundreds of cases all day. uh, Something just gets flagged a lot, then it gets taken down or it gets sent to a reviewer. So that's what happens with my political cartoons, is that this stuff is being reported by people who don't like it. So what is the basis for the takedown on this? Is it the guy shooting, or is it the guy throwing the milkshake in his face? They don't. You never really get an answer, right? I mean, I guess it's depicting violence, but I mean, there's no one being torn apart by bullets, or it's not like the drawing you were talking about earlier from War is Boring or anything. Eventually, this happened a couple more times, and there was a New York Times story about it that was focused on my work, but other people's work, and this whole trend in social media, um, where I did a comic on the Proud Boys. Again, it was actually before January 6th that I did it, but it was basically saying that some of these guys, wanted to do violence to people or overthrow the government. Again, I'm thinking about it. It wasn't any explicit violence in that one either depicted, but it was taken down for whatever incitement or whatever it is, hate. There's these weird guidelines about depiction of hate groups or promotion of hate groups that appears to include criticizing them. It's very, very strange stuff, and obviously they don't do a good job of regulating the platforms anyway, because they're overrun with misinformation and grifters and vaccine conspiracies and stuff like that. So they're just not really well suited for dealing with visual art. I mean, I think visual literacy is a big problem for them anyway, and they're not really incentivized to be nuanced about it.
Yeah, like visual literacy would be one thing. Comics literacy is another. I mean, I
Yeah.
spoke with Neil Cohn for my podcast, and he has this book, Who Understands Comics, that says like we have this assumption about comics that it's sort of it's easier to read them, that they're a kind of gateway to literacy for that reason. But he claims that it actually takes a lot of experience to learn how to decode comics. But yeah, I mean, there's actually so many moments in We Should Improve Society Somewhat that I wanted to talk about, and I'm conscious of time, so I want to, address that book, which is, an incredibly, it's like this diverse array of different, interventions and insights. It's a book that you introduce by saying like you can look at what I'm against and pretty easily figure out what I'm for. And so I started like looking as I was reading the book for the things that you were advocating, using this prompt basically to guide me. And
Mm.
there's like one strip in particular where there are these two kind of self-absorbed white liberals arguing, over again this kind of internal division within the left, arguing over whether class or racism should be front and center in progressive politics. And I gotta say, I felt both seen and personally insulted by that panel, because I actually look a lot like one of the mansplainers in the strip, and I
Yeah,
wonder like
sorry, man.
it's all good. I guess like is part of your goal, or was part of your goal, to basically advocate for good faith debate as a means of achieving something like a more equitable world? Is that
Yeah, I
does that
think
make sense?
I think that's a I think that's a good way to put it. That comic is touching on um, the debate that was happening and has basically almost perpetually happened since 2016. And it goes back even further through all the elections. You always have liberals and the left criticizing each other or blaming each other for what happened. Problem this time was that Donald Trump won, and there was years really of grievances about that, and I think political rifts that permanently affected a lot of people. And I mean, I have plenty of my own opinions about it, but I don't devote my work to it. I think it's kind of alienating to people to kind of constantly, forge your identity by who you hate that is very closely politically adjacent to you, which a lot of people do online, and they did a lot, especially in the aftermath of the 2016 election. So that's what I was going for in that strip. I mean, yeah, I think the way you put it is advocating for more good faith arguments is the best way to say it, really.
And I mean, it's like it could be potentially very powerful, and yet because of the nature of like the media cycle or ecosystem, it's just like not even conceivable somehow. And there are so many moments I think in the book that like hit on this, right? Like there's a panel on the cycle of outrage that social media encourages, and this notion of like observing a social media hiatus. There's a flashback to the creation of the Bill of Rights, where you're imagining these figures anticipating Tumblr and the collection of metadata to like influence elections. Um, since one of the things that you're skewering in the book is the rise of quote online stupidity, I wanted to kind of come back to this question of the web and its maybe social effects by asking about how you use basically social media professionally and personally. Is it this kind of like devil's bargain where you understand it's a core part of a contemporary cartoonist's arsenal, but also fraught in all of these political and social, like, various ways that we now understand fully because of especially the Francis Hogan leaks that show Facebook knew the kinds of social effects it was having.
For sure. I mean, I would definitely say I have a very ambivalent relationship with social media. Um, it's what has made my career in a lot of ways. It's also, completely exhausting to be on it and participate in it all the time. It helps generate a lot of ideas. It's where I find a lot of my readers. I also know, for me and every other creator I know, it's in people who aren't creators. I mean, it also is something that, drives everybody crazy. Um, there, when you can post online, you have no control over where it goes or what people do with it or what they say. Um, that's going back to the last question. I mean, that's why I didn't really want to do a ton of work focusing on this left liberal divide because it really just becomes fodder for argumentation. And that's a lot of my work is kind of going after the way that we talk about things or interact with them online because that really is the way a lot of people experience politics now. It's not the way that people maybe experience the effects of legislation or real politics, but it's how people engage with it. Arguing online, uh, and posting. And that has been a really exhausting part of my career. It's also just an extra thing that you have to do. You're not just asked to create, you have to kind of, be effective at social media. You really have to be on it. You have to be participating in it. Right now I'm off in a lot of ways. I kind of quit Twitter, like for good. Not forever, but I quit it with the intention of not posting anything until I come back with some sort of new project to announce. And then, trying to change my relationship with it a little bit going forward, just posting about my work and maybe not engaging in arguments or not being even as vulnerable or open because once you get to a certain sort of follower threshold, people will tell you that you basically can't post anything without someone jumping on you about it. And I'm not talking about posting a controversial or contrarian political opinion. I'm talking about just pretty much anything, right? It's just so even though I don't, part of me doesn't like what I just said about like, oh, just being on to promote my work and nothing else. Like it feels kind of crass. I think it's like I would rather put my energy into my work and have my work be what I have to say and not be wasting a lot of my time on social media anymore because God knows I did a lot of that in the last decade or so.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, this idea of a very intentional use of social media that is also, openly kind of self-reflexive, self-critical. Seems to me like the responsible position in 2021 to take
Yeah,
regarding social media,
yeah. Well,
Yeah,
it seems like everyone's a little more aware of the pitfalls of social media these days. I mean,
right.
you mentioned the Facebook leaks and everything. I mean,
Hmm.
that's that information is shouldn't be too surprising to everyone, right? I mean, we know that these places have been collecting our data and have a very cynical approach to getting people to be angry or to click on things and to get their attention. I mean, you don't do that with, that's I think that's why a lot of misinformation has proliferated on Facebook in particular, and it's notorious for it because that's what gets people riled up and keeps them on the site so that Facebook can make money. I, have been pretty skeptical about these companies since they since they came about, right? Where you don't really, when they control major publishing, they control a publishing channel that basically everyone is paying attention to. You have to be on there to get anyone's attention, even if it's about something that's not on there, like a book that you're selling or whatever. I mean, you have to have a presence on Facebook and Twitter. So yeah, I definitely hate that aspect of it. And we could all collectively decide on a certain day that we're never going to go on those sites again. But it isn't going to happen. Maybe it'll happen slowly over time, which would be great. But it seems like at this point they're kind of baked in.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the real kind of question now is like, what is the horizon here, And it's interesting now to kind of diagnose social media's social effects in light of things like the Capitol siege and the deplatforming or demonetizing of things like Parler and this insurrection that basically happened in part through online organizing. I mean, there's a moment in We Should Improve Society somewhat where you talk about how you personally reached, quote, the height of artistic achievement circa 2020 online capitalism, the ubiquitous meme, an unpaid and nonetheless exalted cultural position in which a work of art has perfectly captured some aspect of the zeitgeist and allows people to easily respond instead of thinking of something of their own to say, as you put it. So like that acknowledgement combined with the way that you talk about having your character Mr. Gotcha stolen and repurposed got me thinking about the documentary Feels Good Man, which is about
Yeah.
the misappropriation of Matt Fury's Pepe the Frog drawing. You joke about that, pretty consequential bit of property theft in We Should Improve Society somewhat by showing World War II troops speculating that there's no way frog memes will be a Nazi thing by the time we're old. Um, like I'm assuming here that you're familiar with the theft of Matt Fury's Pepe, and I wonder here, like in terms of using social media very intentionally, to what extent you fault Fury. I mean, there's always going to be theft within meme culture. That's what memes sort of are in some sense, is a parasitic sort of thing. But what is different in the context of like diagnosing social media and recognizing that some of those parasites are white supremacists and who, they're going to use these seemingly silly, safe images to perpetuate hate speech. Do you feel like Matt Fury should have protected his character better? That's certainly one of the arguments in Feels Good Man, is that it was largely his inability to protect the circulation of images online that led to this proliferation of hate memes. Do you see it that way, or
Hmm.
is that simplistic?
I haven't seen that documentary, but I do know, a little bit about his situation for sure. I know that he did eventually uh, sue some people, and I think he might have even sued Alex Jones and got them to stop, using it on something like that. But it's hard, man. Once something takes off, you can't put it back in the bottle. It's very hard. I mean, he's tried a lot to, reclaim Pepe, and I think he still uses the character when he does Boys Club. So I don't think it just and then it was kind of appropriated too by like Hong Kong protesters who were using it, and not in a white supremacist context. It's just this very surreal landscape that we exist in now. I mean, there was nothing inherently wrong with his original image. I mean, I think it was just the frog's head saying "feels good, man" that just sort of got around, and then all of a sudden people started making all these variations of it, and it was flourishing on 4chan and places like that where there are a lot of right wing white supremacist type people, and then they did with it what they did. I mean, it's like I think every artist sort of lives in fear that you don't even want to talk about it because you don't want to speak it into existence. If you say, "Oh, I don't want Nazis to appropriate something from my comic," and then they'll do it intentionally to troll you. So yeah,
Yeah,
and
totally. Yeah. This
you
is
know,
the thing, right? Like it is out of your control. And that's why I see it as sort of like the narrative of the documentary is sort of simplistic in that sense, right? They talk to certain artists and say like, Fury took too lackadaisical an attitude around intellectual property and so on, and this was the result. But really, it's there's something else going on, right? I think, and it's about this kind of openness to misappropriation that's characteristic of the web. And like in that
yeah,
context, I wanted to ask you about Mr. Gotcha. Like it's a character that hit on something and that evolved really out of a desire to identify a trend within, political, punditry, or dialogue toward ad hominem attacks on people for like perceived hypocrisy, right? So I think with Pepe the Frog, the reason that became a troll's mascot is that it was an embodiment of apathy, basically. Mr. Gotcha is an embodiment of something else, a certain kind of moral supremacy, or I don't even know if you could maybe define it in your own terms, but you're in your work, you're insisting that hypocrisy is bad, but part of the point of Mr. Gotcha seems to be that we're all kind of vulnerable to the accusation of hypocrisy to some extent because we participate in society, right?
yeah.
Is that basically the point of that character? And I guess like I want to ask, like in the context of polarized political discourse, is it the case now that hypocrisy kind of doesn't mean anything if you can accuse anyone of hypocrisy at any moment?
I've been forced to think about this. I was almost going to call it a meme, but it's actually not a meme. It's just a panel that I drew. Uh, it's a comic I drew, but now it's a meme. But it doesn't really get changed a lot. Some people do, but really it just gets used as kind of like a reaction meme. So, to start out, what I was doing was countering an argument that a pretty lazy argument online, which is just like, oh, you use an iPhone and yet you're criticizing capitalism. And the counter to that is basically that you're saying, we should improve society somewhat. And the comic goes through all these different, well, it starts in the present and then it goes into the past where you end up in the medieval time with Mr. Gotcha popping out of the well. But that is essentially the argument that has always been, put forth in politics, and then argued against by the people who are advocating the status quo, um, which is either, you're doing too much, too fast change. You participate in the system as it is, um, and you're a hypocrite. I mean, I think that the right is actually onto something with that argument. Like the reason why they use it is because I do think that the right is fundamentally aware that there are systems of exploitation in place in the United States and around the world, and that's what our society functions on. and they care a lot less, or they think it's acceptable, and they're saying, look, you accept it too. What are you doing? You're not going out and blowing up an iPhone factory. You're all you're doing is posting online. They want you to just accept the system as it is, and not, and they're trying to sort of like defang your argument by just saying, well, you're a hypocrite, you're participating in it too. But that, that's not really the argument. The argument is we should change this, and we lack the ability to just universally or unilaterally change it. Like I can decide to not use an iPhone because I don't want to participate in that, but people who go too far in that direction are making this weird moral argument that they're pure, they're not going to do it, and the other people who are doing it are all sick and depraved. But that's not going to change anything on a systemic level, right? So sorry, I've definitely thought about this meme
Yeah.
way too much.
No, and this is exactly what the meme or the panel communicates. We can't give an account of our own ambivalence, our own feeling of being vexed by having to participate in an unequal, exploitative, society because of an individualistic kind of culture of discourse that says ultimately what matters is what you individually are doing and whether it is pure, ethical, and so on. Like, yeah, I think it's a go nowhere argument. And one that we're kind of caught in. There's a moment in the book where you convey this really relatable sense of political fatigue. Basically, just you're overcome by everything being bad, like you were saying, like just engaging with politics and feeling like it's just all about just grief and anxiety and misery. Like I love, for example, your strip on the chaotic nature of the financial system, and this is a system that we do have a film like The Big Short to understand, which uses comedy to try and convey something really complex in human terms. And I guess I want to ask, like in a context where, even economists are admitting that we might be approaching things like an inflation crisis, but they don't know why or what inflation, how it really works. I guess I wanted to ask whether you see an increase across the board in comics that try to convey the complexity of finance, capitalism, and the money system.
Mm. Well, I don't know if I've seen an increase in comics trying to do that or not, but with with that comic, I was almost trying to, elide concrete explanations of stuff, and because that's where, people always get tripped up and just sort of portray the financial system as how I think it is in a lot of ways, which is uh, complex to the point of chaotic. And you always have economists and people who uphold the system explaining why everything is operates this way, and that it's the best system, and not generally predicting any of the collapses in advance. Like the 2008 housing crisis being the biggest one that I can think of, where after the fact, of course, everybody says we shouldn't be slicing up mortgage loans and packaging them into other financial products and then selling those as AAA graded uh, things. But then, while they're doing it, it's actually a-okay. So who knows what's going to come next? Recently they were talking about whether or not we should be minting $1 trillion coin to deal with the deficit.
Yeah, I love this idea.
We Yeah, right. I've read, stuff for and again. Who knows, man? I mean, it sounds nuts, right? I think that the truth is that no one actually knows who could do it. It could be fine. You could do it. It could trigger something. Um, we, I certainly don't think uh, many of the people who are paid to know these things actually know the answer, because I don't think there's a definitive one. I think only after we experience these crises and changes are we able to, retroactively sort of put it into a narrative and then say, oh, this happened because we were clearly doing something that was completely irrational and not good for most members of society, except for people who were bundling mortgages and selling them off to the next person. They did fine, but not everybody else.
Yeah, well said. I think there's like, from my perspective, there's something like almost mystical about the cult of belief that Wall Street like represents, and people like Max Haven, who I've interviewed for the podcast, talk about how there's this like priestly caste of economists who are mostly there to reinforce belief in the system, sort of, what you were saying there.
Yeah.
I want to, I don't want to take too much more of your time. I just really have one more question. I really like the way that in We Should Improve Society Somewhat, you're captioning the panels and kind of letting the reader into your thought process for how you created the panels. And at a certain point, you admit that Trump's election stumped you, that you didn't have anything funny to say for once. And for this one kind of big splash panel, you opted for some inspirational defiance. Your use in that panel of like an earnestly inspirational tone is, not something that's characteristic of your work in general. And you talk about the fact that it generally is not the job of a political cartoonist to be sentimental or inspirational in those ways. I guess I'm wondering, like, in terms of your future work, whether you're hoping to explore more of that earnest stuff, like the emotional side of things.
A little bit of yes and a little bit of no. So what I would say is, first, I'm actually gravitating toward doing some like genre work. I right now I'm co-writing a comic book series that hasn't been announced yet, so I can't really say much about it, but it's a creator-owned thing. Sort of sci-fi, dystopian, ultra-violent political thing. And a lot of elements of my work will be present in it. I mean, it's full of satire and social critique, but it's trying to do something. It in some ways it's ham-fisted and obvious, but it's in other ways it is trying to be a little more expansive in the themes and what it's actually talking about. It's not about what's in the news this week. It's about broader themes in society. And I have another project that isn't fully greenlit, but is hopefully going to happen with like some a previously established character that I'm very excited that I hope I get the opportunity to write, in which I'll be doing some of the same things. So, I don't know that I would call these works earnest. I think that they have the same sort of tone of satire as I've done in a lot of my work, but they'll be a little bit less didactic and less oriented around the news. And then long term, I don't have any immediate plans to do a nonfiction book, but I mean, I will at some point for sure. And I aspire to the level of people like Durf and Joe Sacco in the work, and I think in that, I do want to portray reality and nuance and complexity, and also, not neutrality, but not be preachy in the way that political cartoons can be, but be illuminating in the way that the best sort of nonfiction journalism can be.
Wow, well, that is super exciting. And I'm always excited to talk to cartoonists because I think in another life that would have been my preferred like career. It does take an enormous amount of time, a ridiculous commitment. And it's something I'm always fascinated to hear people's like story around how they fell into it. But a lot of people, it seems like it's just they've lived and breathed it from a very young age. So I'm really excited to see what you produce from this point on.
Yeah, thanks, man. These projects, like I said, they take time, even though I'm writing it. Somebody else has to draw it. So I don't even think they'll be announced until next year, but they're things that I've been working on slowly over time, and they're finally starting to happen.
Well, good luck with it all, and thanks so much for making the time.
All right, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.